It's easier, someone once said, to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism.
But it's clear that where we can make systems of this complexity, cultural systems, economic systems, machines of this complexity, surely we could make a world that could first meet those needs I described that everyone should have, and then perhaps meet needs that people have only dreamed of, like the need for some autonomy and freedom. The need for that little space up there, the I part, to expand a little bit. Just a little. Just a little. Just a little.
The socialism that could engage with the yearnings and dreamings
in Miles Davis music.
An aesthetic dimension.
Radically incompatible with everyday life under capitalism.
Hey there, listeners, and welcome to another edition of the Acid Left podcast, in which I, Mike Watson, and my co-host, Adam Ray Adkins, welcome John Duncan from the JohntheDuncan YouTube channel. So John is basically studying a PhD in neoliberalism and human rights as a tool to mobilise collective action against capitalism. And we'll be talking to him about neoliberalism, human rights, and the anti-woke movement, particularly the actor turned right-wing politician and terrible singer Laurence Fox, also celebrity politicians and the role of Scotland in the age of European empire. So stay tuned for all of that and more. Basically, I got to know your work, John, via YouTube and Twitter, and I got particularly kind of involved in it at a point you began to critique the character or the figure Laurence Fox, who's very well known in the UK, apparently isn't known at all in the States, which probably is no bad thing for them. But Laurence Fox is basically I
think Lewis's sidekick is about the level of fame that he deserves.
But, I mean, this would be very hard for people in the States or anywhere else to follow, but basically Lewis was a detective who used to be the sidekick of another detective. And then he got his own program and he had this sidekick who was acted by Laurence Fox. Anyway, this guy is, apart from at some point being married to Billie Piper, has recently entered politics in the UK. And this follows an outburst on the BBC kind of politics talk show Question Time. And he kind of, we'll actually play now what he did, but he was on a panel and he had this kind of following outburst and observation that he made to as it turns out, I believe, academic woman who is, I think she was mixed race. So it's going to play that audio now.
Let's be really clear about what this is. Let's call it by its name. It's racism.
We're the most tolerant, lovely country in Europe. Let's celebrate our women.
Just to interrupt here, what basically she's calling racism is the treatment of Meghan Markle, the wife of Prince Harry. I'm just going to go back there.
Let's be really clear about what this is. Let's call it by its name. It's racism.
We're the most tolerant, lovely country in Europe. Let's celebrate our women.
What worries me about your comment is you are a white privileged male who has no
I mean, I can't help what I am. I was born like this. It's an immutable characteristic. So to call me a white privileged male is to be racist. You're being racist.
Okay, so that was, for me, an incredible exchange. It actually got a lot of support for Laurence, obviously the guy speaking there. And what he's doing is something that happens quite a lot. That seems to happen increasingly. Is he's saying that because white people get a hard time for basically their privileged position, then they are therefore subject to a racism of a kind. I don't know, John, how did that strike you? I know you had a lot of comments at the time, and you actually made a video on it.
Yeah, I mean, like it goes to show like what. I mean, it's a very good example of what Fox's role is, or who he is as a person, because like that's just that's absolute classic YouTube radicalization sort of like comments about, you're saying I'm white and therefore I may not have a perspective on this opinion. That is racist. I'm very smart. And it's like, it's just such a classic bit of right-wing propaganda that you basically, like, you can forget that it just doesn't make any sense in the context of what that woman is saying, which is basically like, what troubles me with you saying Britain isn't racist is that you might not experience racism, is basically the gist of what she's saying. And then him going, well, you're being racist, as his response to that, which if anything, it's like, I know the right accuses the left of this, but if anything, that's a very snowflake position for him to take, to a bit of criticism, to immediately then go, oh no, you're the racist one here. So that sort of the thing that was first interesting to me about him as a character.
Yeah, he does seem personally aggrieved at this and at the idea that he might be privileged when actually he comes from an acting family and he's been on primetime TV for years, and then in the media for years. He's clearly very wealthy, but also just like the wrong-headedness of, well, look, racism is when you discriminate against somebody because of their what we call race, but saying that a culture or a group is racist is something else, no? Or saying that the white majority in Western countries are privileged is talking about really history and a social position. Yeah. It's not a race thing. I'm not saying I don't like you because you're white. It's saying, no, I find the relationship problematic between us because of history, because of things that have happened. So it's not a racism. It's talking about a material situation.
The point he's making is like that color blindness point, essentially, that I don't see race, so therefore anyone who brings up race is the real racist, which usually just serves to, obscure the fact that race is still a factor in everyday life. There's still structural racism. Some people are affected by it and some people aren't.
Oh, absolutely. So, I think what this gets at, though, is like Fox's position is the inability to see a type of metaphor in play with privilege theory. And they want to equate it so strictly to these certain things where it isn't such an easy thing, yet it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Certain like you were saying, third generation Indian immigrants may have certain social or wealth characteristics that you wouldn't say belong to the lowest common in class or whatever, but that's not what privilege or privilege theory is trying to get at. Just like in the US with the right-wing retort to Black Lives Matter being all lives matter, as if that's not included in the idea of Black Lives Matter. Of course, it's Black Lives Matter to elevate the fact that all lives matter, to say that, the way that Black lives are treated in the US is as if they don't matter. So no, all lives cannot matter until Black Lives Matter. I think you see the same type of thing going back for there. And to me, I think is interesting in that clip, because I've seen it go around quite a bit on the internet, and I had no idea who Laurence Fox was before this, is that the clip really focuses all around him. You really don't get to hear what the journalist that was questioning him was trying to ask him. He interrupts her, and then the clip kind of just ends after that, which I think is pretty illustrative of the whole point, where, his voice has become much more important than hers in that viral sensation.
But this was really interesting because that didn't get challenged by anybody on the panels or by the host, Fiona Bruce. It's like the line he took was one that I think was considered generally to be very ignorant, because it's a line that people have heard anyhow, kind of circulating. It's taken to be ignorant by anyone I know, but obviously there's a kind of a portion of society that go along with him, who I don't know, who I don't hang out with. But given how how many people who would watch Question Time, and the Question Time is on quite late. It's like, is it on at 10 p.m.?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
People who are staying up to watch Question Time, one imagines are disproportionately from backgrounds with degrees, or at least you say higher education, but they stayed on after school for some time. They read maybe, Guardian, Telegraph. They read what we used to call the broadsheets. So that the fact that this kind of like line was unchallenged was very strange, and kind of shows to what extent the BBC have moved right, how much they're biased towards the right, which is something that I think we saw a lot in the last general election, Corbyn versus Boris Johnson. There was some kind of terrible bias, but it's often said the opposite way around. And actually the Tories are trying to kind of like take away BBC budgets and restyle how they're managed, because they see a lot of left bias. But I don't see anything like left bias. It may be a bias towards some kind of liberal centre ground, if anything. But we do face that kind of challenge. And maybe the BBC are really like going kind of hard right to avoid having their budgets kind of cut back or their powers cut back. It does seem that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think with regard to the position on white privilege, I think, like you were saying, it seemed unpopular with people who are around like maybe leftist circles. I mean, I think that the idea that he espoused is one that could get some knee-jerk support from like a large percentage of the population. So I don't necessarily, I believe it would be a fringe position would be why, like I can see people not disagreeing with it because it's not exactly a fringe position. The way he says, you're saying I can't understand something because I'm white, that's racist. I can understand why that wasn't challenged by other white middle class or middle and upper class people on the panel.
Yeah, for sure. I think that if the kind of like, if the way that one distinguishes themselves increasingly becomes like, how many grievances do you have, or do you have a grievance? How big is your grievance? This is kind of how identity politics works. It's natural that white people start to kind of like want to air their own grievances, or say, hey, what about me? I don't feel privileged. And of course, a lot of us don't feel privileged. I certainly don't think by many measures I am privileged, but I don't know. I mean, I kind of also learned to try and understand other people's grievances or their particular situations, however they want to put it. If they're saying they feel aggrieved, then they must feel aggrieved to some extent. And then why not try to understand it? I mean, I had this situation teaching, because I taught for 3 years in American study abroad universities in Italy. And we had mixed groups of Italians and Americans and people from different countries. And I was in a position, like many people who teach in the humanities, of talking about feminism and race issues, as well as talking about materialist issues. And one does get in a position of like thinking, well, I'm talking about these issues, but what right do I have to talk about them? And you have to check your own privilege to some extent. I don't know if you've ever been teaching or had that position in other contexts, but I have no problem sort of saying, hey, I have to first, in a teaching context, I have to first, get past the point or talk about a point, discuss a point that actually, to some extent, I am privileged, being a white English man. I mean, that's three things that are immediately considered to be a privilege. I've never had any money, nor did my family. But I don't mind putting that out there, even if I know I'm talking to a class in which there are some American Africans who may have much bigger incomes than me. It's like, well, who am I to start? My point is I need to be understanding their lack of privilege as a teacher, not airing my own. But even in general society, maybe because I learned that from teaching, but I think it's just generally how I want to approach things, is that I know my position. You know what I mean? And I have points in which I'm allowed to air my grievances about various things that I feel relevant to my life. But as much as possible, I'd like to put that aside and just listen to other people and take their feelings at face value. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the position that the woman in the clip is essentially making. Isn't like, she's not saying to Fox there, you're not allowed to talk about something. She's explaining why he might not see a perspective. So I think that's an issue that gets like twisted up when people talk about privilege or identity politics, or like comedians who say you can't say anything anymore. When people criticize them, it's not necessarily like you can't say anything. It's here's why your perspective doesn't necessarily reflect reality, and why you might not be able to see that. And I think the issue with like checking your privilege and language about that is accepting the awareness that you might not see something, you might not be aware of something like that, which is exactly what Laurence Fox completely failed to do in that clip.
Yeah. Have you listened to any of Laurence Fox's music?
Yes. And preparation, not since I made the video back in March, but when I was making the video, I listened to it just because, I mean, it's kind of interesting to see how terrible he is. And for a man who doesn't understand privilege, how he's managed to get a record deal.
It is actually quite terrible. I agree with you. So I guess his big song is The Distance. And I turned it on, and it's like a hollowed out, soulless, right-wing version of Leonard Cohen.
Yeah,
and I hate it.
I mean, we
it's
can
like that's what he's trying to do.
We can actually play some of that probably now.
Oh, goody.
Here we go.
They have put something in the water. They seek a cure for the conversation. They stole a march on your indecision. And the first to fall was laughter, just to quell the unoffended. They seek to murder your opinion.
All right, that's enough. That's enough.
And the light has been turned out on the age of reason.
Okay, so the age of reason.
They want to murder your opinion is the line that got me.
Yeah. But the first line in that song is they've put something in the water.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and it's kind of, the rest of it goes on, so it seems kind of innocuous, but that even takes it back to some weird conspiracy stuff. It makes me think of like the John Birch Society in America and their belief of fluoride in the water being a secret Marxist plot to turn everyone, you know, to not have the mental capacities anymore. And then nowadays you hear about some of that with like the Alex Jones community, talking about the water effeminizing people and whatnot.
Yeah.
Now I haven't heard Fox say anything directly along those lines, but it's interesting to see how he is actually kind of in that lane there.
If I was going to be really mean for a second about his music, we should remember that is the studio recording. That was the amount of production that goes into making studio recordings sound listenable, and that was the best they could make it. It's so sweet to me that that's the best that they could get it. There's the terrible recording of him on I think Good Morning Britain, where it's so out of tune. It's incredible how he thinks that this is a viable path for him to go down.
It does seem really weird, but one thing he does is like he has this kind of slightly working class demeanor, or at least not upper middle class or middle class demeanor. At least the way he dresses, he's a little bit scruffy.
He has tattoos on his hands.
Yeah, and the way he's talking is not like very clipped. And I just want, it's almost like he's also like being a really bad musician, because that's how he might connect with the people. It's like, he's like, I'm one of you, with his working class demeanor, and then I'm also a shit musician. Like,
yeah, I'm just like you. I'm also terrible.
Also can't sing.
I do have to say though, I think in some of the interview clips I've seen of him, not that I liked what he was saying, but he can say it well, you know, and he does. It is by playing into that working class persona. And like, you know, being one of the boys is kind of how he seems to be putting himself off.
He seems more like a working class person who's trying not to show any kind of affectation from being from a working class background than a middle class person playing down. You know,
I guess being an actor really, I mean, if you're going to become an ideologue on media, being an actor is a good way to go about doing it, making the nonsense you speak seem important. It's kind of the whole deal of acting, isn't it?
Yeah, but it just interests me how he hasn't really gone full on working class. I don't think there's much rhyme or reason, because he can't sing and he's tried to try a musical career. He's obviously not trying to be looking like he's upper middle class, but he doesn't seem particularly working class. And then he seems to have gone incredibly far with all of this, which is kind of what's worrying. And he was even with Billie Piper for years.
Yeah, that's kind of the rough life of an actress.
Okay, so anyway, this Laurence Fox, I mean, it seems to be part of this trend towards celebrity politicians, which people trace to Trump often, but it actually predates this, and it's worth bearing in mind that Reagan, president in the early 80s, was an actor.
I've been collecting stories that are told in the Soviet Union by their people among themselves, which reveal they've got a great sense of humor, but they've also got a pretty cynical attitude toward their system. And I told this one, Bill, you'll have to hear it again. I told it in the car. I didn't tell this one to Gorbachev. You know, there's a 10-year delay in the Soviet Union of delivery of an automobile. And only 1 out of 7 families in the Soviet Union own automobiles. There's a 10-year wait. And you go through quite a process when you're ready to buy, and then you put up the money in advance. And this happened to a fella, and this is their story that they tell, this joke, that this man, he laid down his money, and then the fella that was in charge said to him, okay, come back in 10 years and get your car. And he said, morning or afternoon? And the fellow behind the counter said, well, 10 years from now, what difference does it make? And he said, well, the plumber's coming in the morning.
There's an interesting thing about Reagan. He was known as the great communicator, but all of that was public facing. Stories from how Reagan dealt or communicated with other politicians, like I think Gorbachev, there's a story of him talking to Gorbachev, and they were just like, they were having this conversation, and then Reagan left the room and came back and tried to summarize the conversation they just had, but left the Russians completely bemused about what he'd been saying because they had no recognition of that conversation. So apparently he just liked to sort of phase out and not really care about what other people were saying, and then just go out with his own story, which is another nice wee parallel to the leader that they've got now. One that just like has his public facing jokes and charisma, but is completely useless in anything more policy oriented.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite bizarre, really. I mean, it's been kind of some really crazy stuff happening this week. I mean, claiming that he found the cure for COVID, and that is a good thing he got ill, because when he went to hospital, they offered him all this kind of drugs that they were kind of in the process of developing, and he said,
Regeneron.
Yeah, and he said, I will have that one. And it's a good thing he said he'll have that one, because it turned out to be a good cure, and now everyone's going to have that one. And no one's stopping him doing this stuff. And I just assumed there was a whole team of people who were telling the president what to say and who could stop them doing certain things. But it seems now that there can't be anyone doing this.
It must be like wrangling like a puppy or something. Like, you can try and contain it, but at some point it's just going to shit on the floor.
Yeah, but how many times he's allowed to do that? It's really weird. I mean, I just thought they were like actors who would, I mean, not in literal sense, but often they even literally are actors who were just told, go out and say this. But it doesn't seem to be the case. And I thought actually they were allowed often to go off message, because it kind of helped to have someone just saying stupid shit in front, because it could hide what's really going on in the background. So at points, George Bush would just seem like an idiot. That just kind of throws people off the scent of what's really happening behind the scenes. And of course, that's still happening, obviously, with Trump, but it's to such a large degree that it seems that it's not really by any design on the part of the Republican establishment or the deep state, but maybe it is actually.
So back in like 2009, 2010, Zizek actually predicted the rise of the Berlusconi figure. And in what he said was that like one of the things that it relies on is this like clownish figure who is obscene, that makes you laugh with him. But with Trump and with this like really cynical age that we're in, it's using the fear as like part of the laughter, right? Like the immigrants, the leftists, they're laughing at them in fear, and that's like the whole thing. It's this violent and obscene enjoyment throughout the whole process.
Yeah, but there's also this kind of thing that Adorno said of the kind of the smile stroke grimace of the leader. which I kind of mentioned in a book I wrote years ago called Towards a Conceptual Militancy, just to get a plug in there. And I'm kind of talked about this kind of thing of the stricken face of the powerful. If you look at a lineup of the G8, it looks like a lineup of cadavers. Do you say cadavers? Coffins. When you get these pictures from, it was particularly, I think, from Kosovo, there was this kind of pictures, but often from wars, you get these lined up kind of very basic coffins with these people dead, and they have these kind of stricken rigor mortis jaws. That it kind of looks similar when you see a lineup of the powerful. And it's this kind of like one size fits all, one expression fits all look that it's kind of like a look of like, just kind of leave me alone. You see, you know what I mean? It's like, it's a confused look, this kind of constant smile. It's a bit like a deterrent for any further interaction. You know what I mean? It's like you can't ask a question to somebody who's smiling manically. So yeah, it has that kind of aspect, and it did seem to be perfected in our time by Berlusconi, and I suppose him being like in recent time the first kind of politician as celebrity rather than vice versa. But we seem to be seeing now a kind of rise of the celebrity as politician again, and I think Laurence Fox is maybe one of those.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I place Laurence Fox in a similar sort of category as the likes of Trump and or even like Kanye West as well. I think their politics, the reason he started a political party is, I don't think because he really gives a shit about winning power. I think he's just trying to make some news cycles. And maybe to a degree that was the same with Trump, I don't know, but what he very much did win power and here we are. But I think that has been like a celebrification, if that's a word, of like politicians basically since Reagan, like Reagan and Thatcher. I mean, I think Thatcher had her cult of personality was enormous, and she was I think still is, would be considered a celebrity. And these tendencies probably increased with the advent of mass media and morphed in the advent of social media. Like, I don't think Trump would have won in an age that didn't have Twitter.
Not at all. And he ran several times before that. I think, I think you're right about that. And you're seeing, maybe this dates back to like the shift in tide with the television debates. Like I know in the US, the Kennedy versus Nixon debates, it's like the people that watched it on television had a different perception than the people that listened to it on radio. And now it's come to the point where, I don't think you can expect to see a boring politician, win anything in the future. It's like, it's really hard to imagine a boring president, even if their entertainment is from horror, like Donald Trump, or I don't know, confusion, like Joe Biden.
Yeah, and also it's worth bearing in mind that Boris Johnson was actually a TV persona before he was a politician.
Yeah,
and he has huge personality.
Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
But when you say that, do you mean huge personality? You mean like he has a big persona that is something positive, or you just mean he's like all personality and no policy?
That his personality is part of why people like him. It's like, it's a strong part. It's a big personality that, one of the reasons why why people talk about him so much, just like Trump and these others.
What's an interesting difference, I think, between Boris Johnson and Trump is that by all accounts, Boris Johnson's bumbling like charm persona is a creation that he actively goes out to like generate, whereas I think Trump is just unabashedly Trump. And I think that influences how different people might want to satirize them. And I think about the return of Spit and Image in the UK, they've satirized Boris Johnson as being a bumbling oaf, which doesn't make sense given the image that he wants to present to the world is of a bumbling oaf. So you're not satirizing it, you're just reinforcing it.
I mean, the thing is, Trump doesn't seem to have a policy agenda, really. He only seems to want to be in power, I think. I mean, the policy agendas he puts forward are only really to gain power, whereas Boris Johnson, I think, has a quite clear agenda. So there definitely is that difference. Johnson seems a bit more shrewd, although his kind of policy set has changed a lot since he was mayor of London, and he was actually pro-Europe, and he was more of a kind of very liberal centrist kind of.
He's definitely shifted with the winds.
Yeah, he has. Yeah, to be in power, but yeah, he definitely has always wanted to be in power as well, he's also had like an agenda, I suppose, which is hyper-Thatcherite, but it's become kind of hyper-Thatcherite with racialist elements.
I get the impression from Boris Johnson that where he is politically now is more natural for him than the sort of liberal wing of the Conservative Party where he stood when he was London mayor. I suspect that would have more been a reflection on the constituency he was trying to win, being London, rather than a reflection of his underlying opinions. I suspect with regard to things he's written throughout the years that he's always been fairly hard right.
Yeah, I don't know, but some of these racist things seem to just be complete ignorance where he's so sheltered and probably grew up nearly all with very, very wealthy white people.
Have you heard or read Boris Johnson's novel at all?
No, I have. I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
Well, to summarise it's awful. It's one of the worst things, like it's kind of existentially awful, but it follows the career of a bumbling politician who's always having affairs with other people's wives, and he fixes a terrorist incident in Westminster by not having a mobile phone. He didn't have a mobile phone because he doesn't like getting caught having affairs, and that's the entirety of his novel. It's all like it's inflected like deep Islamophobic and anti-Semitic tropes throughout, but that's like the story of it.
Yeah, that sounds pretty awful. Yeah,
gives an indication of the type of guy he is.
Maybe Laurence Fox will make a Broadway musical about it.
Oh God.
Yeah, we can only hope. Yeah, this is we have coming up. Because he's going to be running for election, so who knows what Fox will be getting up to get attention, to draw attention to himself. And it's not even implausible that he'll get votes and maybe even a seat in Parliament, or someone in his party could, because Nigel Farage was a complete joke.
I would be amazed. I mean, the last celebrity who ran for a small party in the country were Count Dankula and Sargon of Akkad, and both of them lost their deposits, and they were running for like established UKIP positions. So I'd be amazed.
I didn't even know Sargon of Akkad was in the UK. For some reason, I thought they were American. I have seen them speak. I don't know why I thought that.
Yeah, he's a UK based dickhead.
Okay. But I mean, I don't know I suppose Laurence Fox is better known. I don't think they'll probably get a seat on the first time, the first kind of try. Depends how long they last, and there's every chance they won't last that long. I mean, Farage was in it for a lot longer. But anyway, to change the tone slightly, or probably quite a lot, this might get a bit serious. Your PhD thesis, it tends to make people get very serious when you mention this, especially if they're still writing it. Which I believe you're still writing, though.
Yeah.
As stated in the intro earlier, is on human rights as a tool for challenging, I guess, neoliberalism as such, capitalism, or the worst excesses of them. I don't really like saying worst excesses, because I suppose if you're challenging capitalism, you're challenging it outright. Unless you're David Attenborough, but we'll get to that a bit later. But how does this work? So challenging neoliberalism through human rights. I like the notion. Human rights obviously hugely important. I'm a little worried about human rights being ripped up when we finally properly leave the EU, when the UK does, because that's one possibility, that they can kind of withdraw the UK from many human rights accords, which they have under EU membership. I'm all for human rights, but how is that linking to challenging kind of the worst excesses of capital, or capital as such? Couldn't one argue that human rights are already kind of covered by a kind of broad socialist outlook?
Well, my position is basically it's not going to be challenged through legal institutions. So this isn't like an argument for what human rights laws would help in this situation, because I don't think that's a tenable position. But it's more to do with how to forge linkages and connections between emergent social movements and try and develop some form of mass social movement in response to some of these issues. I think like often human rights is dismissed in quite a out of hand manner by many on like the left, the traditional Marxist left, because they'll look at quotes like, I think it's Critique of the Gotha programme, where Marx talks about rights being a bourgeois project. But I think such arguments are quite... They're based on an assumption about what human rights is. They view human rights as law, as a legal institution, rather than as what might be more better understood as a form of discourse, something that's a collective call to reflect injustice, or to put it in new social movement terms, an injustice frame with which you can demand justice. So I'm basically looking to see if human rights is something that is accessible and useful for social movements and forming linkages between social movements.
So is what you're saying there, you think that it provides like a universal quality that could, I guess exactly what you just said, link to social movements, maybe in ways that would help, like to bring it back to the beginning, help white people who would be adverse to the terms understand like privilege theory, or to like move beyond that in a way?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. A lot is made in human rights literature about how it's universalistic, and that universalism can be used as like a imperialistic weapon to throw onto other states, like, oh, this place doesn't have human rights, therefore it's bad. But I think there's definitely a degree to which human rights, in reality, I mean, I'm looking specifically in the UK, that has become quite a universalistic way of expressing injustice. Like, oh, this is against my human rights, even if it's not a legal issue. It's just, I see this as unjust, therefore it's against my human rights. I think there's a way of expressing that, which I think is quite useful for groups like Black Lives Matter in explaining why they feel injustice is done upon them.
But then also, I guess you could say that you're seeing some of that language being utilized in some of the anti-lockdown or anti-mask protest as well. You know, they're claiming it's against a fundamental human right. So how would we incorporate human rights strongly while trying to distinguish between those two forms?
That's a fair question. I mean, on the one hand, that kind of it does show the universalistic nature of it. So the easy to understand nature of human right justice claims, but with any claim that's universalistic, you're going to get it being appropriated in ways that are damaging to your movement. So I don't have an answer for that question as of right now. Not much I can say.
I don't either. I wish I did too, because I like what you're saying. That's just that's also something I think about as well, because I've noticed that come up a lot more recently in that, like, where I live, there's a fair amount of the anti-lockdown and anti-mask protests. So seeing them switch to those kind of languages and try to appeal to like basic liberty and universal stuff like that it's interesting, because it's not where they normally come from.
I think it's like a reflection of if something starts becoming like a hegemonic, then you're going to get lots of different expressions of how that is expressed. But that doesn't necessarily reduce the effectiveness or the usefulness of the increasingly dominant way of expressing yourself.
I'm just wondering here, just if I can cut in, but I mean, human rights seems to me quite abstract. I mean, is it not beneficial to tether them somehow to materialism? I just kind of see a kind of worry that the notion that we should be good to each other is kind of very, very malleable and easily swept aside when people decide just to ignore it.
I mean, there are ways that that human rights is grounded in very materialistic concerns. The example that springs to mind would be the International Peasants Movement via Campesina. They've used human rights to basically ground their demands for peasants and indigenous rights, and in very material opposition to institutions like the IMF and World Bank coming into their areas and taking their land. They've basically utilised human rights as a way to say, no, to take this space is taking away parts of our humanity, since our humanity is grounded in the space in which we occupy. So I think that
sounds interesting, but it sounds a bit like this kind of enshrinement of nature as a sentient being or as a citizen, which you get like in the Ecuadorian constitution. But then you got this kind of weird thing of like, you're kind of like trying to like give recognition to nature, but on account of human-made laws, it's still like somehow dominating nature. And I just think about this thing of human rights and and economic politics in a similar way? Or do I want to kind of like believe the two can be fused?
I mean, the entire economic and social rights program was derived from socialist principles and by socialist states in the foundation documents of the UDHR. Like the entire economic and social right agenda was pushed basically by the Soviet Union in direct opposition from the US and the UK.
Yeah, I mean, I think, don't get me wrong, it's like I want to just like have human rights because it kind of to me is a no-brainer. But you see people like Laurence Fox, you know, or whoever who don't obviously think like we do. So then it's so subjective that you kind of need something else to shore it up in a way. And that's why I think, because you think of the kind of basic principle, like the golden rule, or sometimes it's called, but you know, you get it in many religions, you get it in Kant. Treat other people as you would like to be treated, basically. I think there's a more eloquent way of saying it. Do unto others as you would like done to you. But this is kind of like, these things are always kind of very watery, because it's like, well, come on, that requires that everybody is decent human being, you know, who wants to be treated in a decent way. Do unto others as you want done to yourself. Or what if, like, there's Donald Trump and the kind of the Russian dossier, him on a bed in a Russian hotel being urinated on by Russian prostitutes, possibly. But, you know, so he likes to be pissed on. So does that mean he gets to piss on people? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Do unto others as you want done to yourself doesn't entirely hold up. It needs everyone to be sane, or to want decent things done to them. You have to have self-respect at the outset, for example. But that's just one way of saying that it's highly abstract and highly subjective. So I kind of, you know, I see Marx as kind of tethering the whole thing to economics to get around that. So I mean, I'm just kind of throwing that out there. I just think it's a challenge, you know. How do you blend the two?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of way I consider getting around that is really looking in terms of just, first of all, functionally, does this discourse help these social movements? Does it help them forge connections between each other? And if it does help, then you look at the movements themselves and what their specific demands are. If those demands are based on, if they're like labor movements or Black Lives Matter based on material concerns of the economic, then that's a different question. But the tool for linking those together might not necessarily need to have such a strong like grounding in the material and like materialism.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah,
and there's also the dimension that like human rights right now is expressed very vaguely or is expressed in different ways. If you have a movement which is like grounded in material concerns and they use human rights, that changes the nature of what human rights are. If we construct, like we use things to construct meaning, and if we use a movement to construct a meaning of human rights which is more grounded in that material reality, that might help human rights as a discourse as much as human rights might help the movements themselves.
Yeah, I mean, just to segue into the next point, I mean, this all requires kind of having a healthy understanding of history and politics in the first place. I don't think one can really appreciate their role in human rights or what human rights really means without having some kind of wider kind of grounding, which I think is where you get this issue, exactly what we were talking about earlier, Laurence Fox, the way people dismiss the idea that there are aggrieved or kind of mistreated communities because, you know, they immediately feel on the defensive somehow. If they had a better grounding in history or a better attitude towards it, they might not see that. They might not feel that way. You kind of looked at history in your most recent video, I believe it was, called Scottish Imperialism, Cultural Amnesia and Ben Shapiro. And you basically argue that the Scots, contrary to popular opinion, both in and outside Scotland, were very much involved in imperialism. Now, I, as an English person and in a position I mean, I'm acutely aware of England's role in so many terrible things. I tend to say England rather than saying Britain, because I have many friends and associates who are from other British countries, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. So I kind of like, you know, I tend to go along with the idea that it's a lot of it's the fault of England because that's what I've been told. And I'm also just happy to go along with that. And I left England on purpose like 12 years ago to go to Italy, and now I'm in Finland. I do see problems with Finland. I left at a point when the CCTV cameras per capita were the most in the world. That may have been overtaken now, but it was a country that was going kind of slightly insane. It was like the forerunner of a kind of Stalinist capitalism. And I think that was a lot to do with Blair and Brown, and it might even be more Brown, because I think he has that kind of tendency, Gordon Brown. But anyway, I tend to talk down England, and I wouldn't ever kind of diss Scotland. I mean, how is it as a Scottish person pointing out to Scottish people that Scotland was involved in empire?
Yeah, I mean, like it's quite, like you said about England not criticising Scotland, it's quite common from living down in London that you get like more progressive English people who look at Scotland in the same way Americans look at Canada. It's a sort of progressive heartland that's been dragged along in these negative things on England's behest. But like, and I think that's reflected a bit in Scotland. Like the idea that Scotland is naturally more progressive than England is really common up here, even like among people who should in many ways know better. And a lot of the time criticism of that gets mashed up in criticism or discussion about independence. So it's and because independence is such an emotive issue for people, it's quite difficult to have a discussion about the political realities in Scotland or Scotland's political history. And all these things are tied up in what often comes up as a sort of victim mentality in Scotland, like Scotland was a victim of England. So it makes these things quite difficult to talk about. And it was interesting in response to the video. I got quite a few comments from people from Scotland saying like, "Oh wow, I didn't realise this. It's really interesting. I've kind of felt like it's a bit odd that Scotland never talks about empire, but I never really knew how to express it." And those are really positive. But on the other side, someone posted the video to the subreddit R Scotland, which is sort of like a nationalistic, uncritical hotbed of Scottish nationalism, and it immediately got downvoted to nothing. And my comment thanking the guy saying, "Oh, thanks for sharing this," got immediately downvoted to nothing as well. So clearly there's people who are not too happy about that perspective.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I can imagine that there would be people who might not be happy, because I suppose like many people, I might get my kind of like natural negativity to England, not from other English people, but from like Scottish, Welsh people, French people. I mean, just people I've known who've been anti-English. I mean, really, at some point, all of the surrounding countries, if you met anyone from them, they would be quite disparaging about the English.
Yeah.
And so you kind of learn to be too, unless you go the other way and get super patriotic as an English person.
I mean, it's not as if we shouldn't blame England. It's just Scotland's shit too. It's like we're all just shit.
I think it helps to. Well, I mean, it's kind of an exercise in truth, I suppose. You're pointing out, if people cannot challenge things if they don't actually know what happened. So I think it helps all people to feel a little bit complicit somehow. You know what I mean? I mean, we're all complicit. Yeah. In capitalism, we all buy our stuff, we all pay our taxes, if we do pay taxes.
I think in Scotland, the narrative that it was all England, that the source of our woes are all England, or all Westminster, no matter like how progressive you might think a movement is, if your founding problem is Westminster and not, say, capitalism as a whole, then you've got a limit on the things you can achieve. I think that's something that the Scottish left and the independent supporting left would do well to remember.
Yeah, I mean, it's very complex now, though, because you have a situation of having a Scottish Parliament and then having Scots in the English Parliament.
Yeah,
it's a mess, because there's some things which Scots might have a certain kind of desire to affect British politics against the interests of English people, and then their Scottish MPs in the English Parliament can do that. This is a bit of an oversight, and to get sorted soon.
And there's things like
resentment. I mean, there could clearly be resentment towards Scotland coming from that, and there is, I think.
No, yeah, I think so as well. I think you do get some of that, and down in London, you do get some resentment as well towards Scottish folk. But I wouldn't want to overstate that, because I think that's something that gets overstated a lot by some Scottish people, which again sort of plays into that similar kind of victim mentality that pervades a lot of the discourse around here.
Yeah, there's that train spotting rant.
It's shite being Scottish.
But yeah, I do remember that very clearly. I think it's stamped on many people's minds, that film and that dialogue. So there is very much that thing of the Scots do run themselves down.
I mean, there was an interesting reaction I got from the video, was that people who weren't Scottish also seemed to react quite badly against it. I had quite a few comments, like knee-jerk reaction comments saying, "And this is nonsense, Scotland was colonised," but they weren't Scottish people. I don't know why. I'm not sure why they had such an emotionally invested interest in it. I suspect they were maybe Americans who had forged Scottishness in part of their identity, but I don't know. It was a strange thing.
I can see how that might happen, but the thing is, we're coming up to the last minute and a half, and I'm just wondering: is Donald Trump has a golf course in Scotland? Does that kind of endear Scottish people to Trump at all? Does that endear anyone to Trump?
No, not really.
Who are you kind of coming out for in the election? Are you kind of pro Trump or pro Biden? There's a loaded question.
I mean, my position generally being would be Americans who lived in swing states should probably vote Biden, because that, I think, just in any measure that matters, Biden would probably be better than Trump. I don't buy any sort of argument that if the left withholds its vote for the Democrats, that the Democrats will suddenly start caring about the left. I don't think that follows from anything we've ever seen historically.
I think we're both with you on that, or I think Adam that way, but we'll just leave it at that. The election is coming up very soon. We hope Trump goes on. Getting nervous about it. But anyway, thank you very much, JohntheDuncan.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Soon, and been brilliant to talk.
Absolutely, it's been grand. Cheers for having me.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Bye bye.